Hi, everyone. My name's Chris Burns, and today I'd like to talk to you about my career at Pfizer. I've been at Pfizer for about 15 years, and in that time, I've had a number of different roles across the company where I've done everything from working hands-on in a laboratory to leading projects to doing regulatory strategy to my role now, where I head up a group who's responsible for what we call digital strategy and knowledge management. So I'll talk a little bit more about what that actually means and what I do on a day-to-day basis in a few minutes. But first, I wanted to tell you a little bit about my background and about how I got to Pfizer. When I was in middle school and high school, I always liked science class. I liked biology. I liked chemistry. And so when I was getting ready to go to college, I knew that I wanted to do something that involved, lab work. I just didn't really know what. I went to a college called Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in upstate New York. And there I found a degree that was called bioinformatics and molecular biology. And it was a dual degree where basically half the classes were kind of your traditional biology and chemistry classes where you learned the basics and you had labs and you kind of learned how to do lab work. But the other half of the degree was focused on using computers and technology to either understand data that was being generated from traditional lab experiments or using them to actually generate their own data. So for example, maybe you'd create a model of a protein and then you'd run a bunch of simulations on it to try to determine what that protein would do under a bunch of different conditions. And so for me, it was really the perfect combination of science and technology. And once I learned about that degree, I knew that's what I wanted to study. I didn't necessarily know what I wanted to do for a career, but I figured I'd worry about that once I graduated. So once I did graduate, I knew I wanted to work in the pharmaceutical industry. And I had a friend who was already working at Pfizer who told me about what was called formulation development. It sounded interesting, so I interviewed and I got a job, and that's where my career started. So formulation development, for anybody who doesn't know, basically means that you are working on drugs that are either in clinical studies or about to go into clinical studies. And we'd be responsible for testing the drug to make sure that it was stable, to make sure that it was safe, and to make sure that we understood basically how it was reacting to different environmental conditions. So the drug itself, the active part of the drug, is usually not all that stable. So you have to add things to it to help it stay stable over time. We add amino acids, we add sugars and salts. We add what we call surfactants, which are things that help kind of mitigate aggregation so that things don't stick to each other. But there's all sorts of different things you could choose from, and there's all sorts of different amounts that you could add. So our job was to basically run a set series of experiments, take certain measurements and help us to understand what types of sugars and what types of salts and how much of them we needed to add to basically make the protein happy, we'd call it. We wanted to find what conditions made the protein happy so that it was safe, that it was stable, and that we could then bring it into clinical studies and inject it or infuse it into patients so that we could actually see what it would do in a real world setting. So it was really a great way to start my career. I got to work in a lab every day. I got to actually handle, these products that could potentially save people's lives and cure their disease and treat their conditions. And I got to be a big part of it. I got to run experiments that generated data, that went into making key decisions. I got to learn lots of fundamental laboratory techniques. So, anything from learning how to correctly weigh and learning how to correctly pipette liquids to how to run really cutting edge instrumentation that I always heard about and learned about in my classes, but never actually got to use myself before. So it was a really great way to get introduced to the pharmaceutical industry and a really great way to learn kind of those fundamental skills that are always going to apply, no matter where you work. So after a couple of years of doing that, I kind of graduated from running the experiments to designing the experiments. So kind of took that next natural step forward where I actually had people who were executing the experiments now that I was putting together. My focus was always on when we could use computers to help us design these experiments. So, could we use statistics to cut down the number of things that we had to test in order to get to the same results? Or could we use programming, maybe Python or R or, any programming language you can imagine? Can we automate the processing of the data that we're generating to turn things around quicker and not have people spend so much time looking at it themselves? Are there ways that we can make that more efficient? That was kind of always my focus, and it worked really well. Laboratory data are one of those things that tend to be very time consuming to analyze. And so anytime you can bring some technology to bear, anytime you can bring some new tools to help with that, it's a really big payoff. So in my time kind of designing experiments, I came up with lots of ways to be more efficient, new analytical techniques, new data processing techniques that were all really, really helpful and really successful. And so because of that, I then got the chance to now lead projects. So instead of just designing experiments, I was determining the entire development strategy for new drugs that were either, in the middle of clinical trials or were coming into clinical trials. And just kind of by chance, I got this opportunity at the same time that our company was getting into what we called biosimilars. So in the part of the pharmaceutical industry I work in, which we call large molecule pharmaceuticals, a biosimilar is what you would probably think of as a generic medicine. So, if you go to, for example, CVS and you've got, name brand Tylenol, and next to it, you've got kind of the CVS brand Tylenol, right? That's the generic version. In large molecule pharmaceutics, that didn't exist until basically I started working on getting to lead projects. So not that I came up with this concept or anything, just the timing worked out. That there were new regulations that the FDA put into place. There were new laws that were passed, and it created a pathway for creating these large molecule generics, essentially. So that's what I started working on from a project lead perspective. I actually led the development of 2 different biosimilars, both of which are actually on the market now, which is pretty rare for anybody in the pharmaceutical industry. Most people spend their whole career working on products that never make it to the market. I got super lucky and ended up working on 2 that, right off the bat got approved, which was a pretty amazing experience. So I learned a lot by being a project lead, not just the science and the technical side of things, and there was a lot to learn there, believe me, but also kind of the management side of things. How do you communicate with, the 30 or 40 or sometimes the 100 people who are also supporting this project? How do you manage team schedules? How do you make sure that people have their priorities, aligned, and we're all pushing in the right direction, and we're not doing things that are either duplicating each other's work or running in counter directions? So it wasn't necessarily a scientific learning experience, but it was a good learning experience for how to work in a big company and how to manage a team. At the end of my time leading projects, I began doing a lot of regulatory work. So this was writing the documents that would, for example, go to FDA in the US or would go to the EMA in Europe. And there's a really specific way that these things need to be written. There's lots of regulations we need to follow. There's lots of laws and rules and guidance. And there's very specific ways that you need to word things. There's very specific ways you need to communicate things. And that was another good learning experience for me, to learn that it's not just about knowing the information, right? As a project lead and as an analytical scientist, I knew all the data, I knew everything about the assays, I knew everything about the product, but understanding how to then communicate that in a specific way was a really valuable skill. A lot of times what would happen is somebody would just assume, that a regulator, somebody from the FDA, just knows all of this fundamental stuff that we all know because we work in the industry. And if they don't include that in their reports or in their summaries or in the correspondence they send, it causes a lot of problems. So I really had to learn how to clearly communicate, how to word things or write things in a way that was very, very clear and very straightforward. And it also taught me how to ask, I think, good questions. A lot of times when we are, talking with inspectors or with regulators from these regulatory organizations, you have to know exactly how to ask the question you want to get an answer for. If you don't ask a good question, you're not going to get a good answer, and that might lead you off on totally the wrong path. So again, it wasn't really a scientific learning experience for me, but it was a good life learning experience, and it was something, it was a skill that I still use basically every day in my current role. And so, like I mentioned, my current role is that I lead a group who's responsible for digital strategy and knowledge management. And it's kind of a vague term, it's kind of a broad bucket, but basically my group is responsible for anything related to new technology coming into our analytical research and development department. So this could be anything from new data processing software. So I'm working on a project right now where we're looking to automate the analysis of huge amounts of data. We have experiments where we're generating 500 gigabytes to a terabyte of data every day. And we need somebody to go in and look at all that data and find a way to process it and get the results we need. So obviously a person's not going to be able to do that. So we're looking at ways to use computers and AI to help us analyze that data and give us the results we need. To things like automated visualizations. So, do we have easy ways to get what we would call metadata in front of people? So, for example, how many projects are we currently working on? For each of those projects, how many samples are there? How many analysts are working on them? Which lab instruments are they using? Which labs are they working in? All stuff that you as a person could probably figure out by going around and talking to people and asking people. But we've come up with ways to just automate that, to just get that data from our systems and just create graphs and charts and figures and visualizations that get people the information they need intuitively, efficiently, and without needing to spend all day, going around asking questions. And so for anybody who's considering a career in the pharmaceutical industry, or even thinks they might be interested in learning more about pharma, I've got two pieces of advice. The first one is don't limit yourself. What I mean by that is a lot of people assume you have to be a scientist or maybe a doctor to work at a drug company, but that's not true. There's certainly plenty of jobs for doctors and scientists at drug companies, but there's also plenty of jobs for people with all sorts of other backgrounds. Things like being a graphic designer or a writer or an accountant, a lawyer, a heavy machine operator, an electrician. Pretty much no matter what your background is, there's probably going to be a role for you at a drug company where you can be a key contributor and you can help us develop new medicines and get them to patients to help treat their diseases and save their lives. My second piece of advice would be that if you're going to work in the pharmaceutical industry, you're going to have to learn how to deal with failure. It's an unfortunate reality of working in industry, but it is the reality that more often than not, our drugs are going to fail. Often it's not because anybody did anything wrong. It's just part of drug development that you'll never know whether or not something's actually going to work until we actually test it in patients. And so learning how to deal with the failure of a program that you may have been supporting for years, working days, working nights, working weekends to try to get it done, it can be tough and it's definitely a skill. But the important thing is that we always try to find a positive to pull out of it. So maybe your drug failed, but you learned some important information about analytical techniques or about formulation conditions that you can now apply to future projects and help increase the chances of them succeeding. So it's a tough skill, but it's an important skill. And it's something that is kind of unique to the pharma industry because there's not many other industries where you fail as often as you do in pharmaceuticals. So that sums up my background and my career at Pfizer. Hopefully what I talked about today was interesting and was helpful. And I wanted to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to talk today about what I do at work. I do work locally, so if a career in the pharmaceutical industry is something that you're interested in or just something you've got more questions about, you can certainly talk to your teachers and they can get in touch with me and I'd be happy to answer questions or make another video or talk more about it. And I would definitely encourage anybody who thinks they're interested to pursue a career in the pharmaceutical industry. It can be tough, it can be stressful, it can be challenging, but it really is the most rewarding career I could imagine having. Just knowing that, my daily work and my daily efforts are helping to treat people's diseases, or in some cases, save their lives with some of our new drugs that we're developing, really is a special feeling that would be hard to come across anywhere else.